G'day folks, welcome to this review of Ted Raicer's The Deadly Woods, The Battle of the Bulge. This was published by Revolution Games in 2021. It is part of that Dark series that has seen the Dark Valley, the Dark Sands, and most recently the Dark Summer. This one, of course, uses that Dark system to focus on the Battle of the Bulge. It is a one-mapper, 22 by 34 inch map, covering the Bulge campaign from the German offensive starting on the 16th of December 1944 through until the 15th of January 1945. So it covers that German offensive and the Allied counteroffensive to compress that bulge and force the Germans back. Ultimately, the Germans are trying to seize Victory Point location. There are about a dozen of these spread around the board. They get victory points if they can hold onto these each turn. But by the end of 12 turns, they really ideally want to hold on to 2 or 3 of these after this Allied counteroffensive. There's also, as I've seen, rules for sudden death. If the Germans can cross the Meuse in strength, they can automatically win the game. If they can at any point hold 5 VP locations at the end of a turn, they automatically win the game. And I've seen that a couple of times now. So yeah, the Germans start the game on the offensive, trying to break through and push through and capture these VPs, and the Americans and Allies are really trying to move rapidly, block these roads, halt the German advance, and then counterattack. It is a 12-turn game, and the turns are abstracted from 2 to 4 days typically. So you're looking at sort of broad scale here. You're also looking at almost division level. You've got what we might call demi-divisions. Divisions are split into 2 or 3 sort of counters, sometimes sort of regimental scale. And as I said, it is chit draw, and the chits represent Allied forces moving or combat or reinforcement chits that bring reinforcements on. The Germans have a lot of special counters that enable them to activate specific armies or formations. There are different supply considerations for both sides. The Allies always need to consider their supply. They're checked every time they try to do something. The German supplies are only checked typically twice per turn when they draw a specific supply chit, and then they check those supplies. So yeah, chit draw mechanism. The chit draws in a game of this scale, particularly in these early turns where you've got this critical offensive underway and the Germans need to break through these roads, the order of chits being drawn is critical. In these first 3 turns in particular, I've had 2 sudden death German victories on turn 3. I have seen the Allies grind this offensive to the halt on the first and second turn. If they can get their reinforcements out early, if they can move to block these German offensives, I've struggled to break through there. So yeah, chit draw mechanism, shaping the order of activations and what side does what in what order. You do often have some flexibility and choice here. So when you draw a move/combat chip, let's say the Americans draw this, they can decide if they want to move or engage in combat. And generally early on, they want to be moving to move their forces around to block the Germans. The Germans might have, let's say, this 3 formation chip, and that basically enables them to activate an armored, mechanized, or motorized, and infantry formation for movement and combat. And you can choose where they are. Typically, of course, they're at the pointy end of your offensive if you're using this formation to really break through, or try to break through. I personally have really struggled. There are, of course, 3 German armies, the 6th in the north, 6th Panzer, 5th Panzer, and the 7th Army. I've struggled with the 6th Panzer Army in the north. I have yet broken through beyond Malmedy. And so there are lessons to be learned here. This is a very replayable game. Every time you play it, you're learning something from the past playthrough and implementing these lessons. And it makes it highly, highly replayable because it does play quite fast, because it is very dynamic with the chit draw, and because there's a lot of options here on this map. Every time you play through, you're trying something different. And yeah, I have struggled with the 6th Panzer Army in the north. Despite trying many different things, I just cannot break through the Americans in the north. Conversely, the 5th Panzer Army further south to around Clairvaux and Bastogne had been very successful, relatively speaking. The lesson here is that the Americans are learning to send their forces further south, but just not sending enough. Once the Bastogne, of course, is a critical location on the map, and if the Germans can capture that, it opens up this very important road network out to the southwest. A lot of American Allied reinforcements come in the north or the northwest. If the Germans capture Bastogne, sort of in the southern shoulder of their offensive, they break through to the southwest, and there's quite a diverse and complex road network that they can use to advance further to, for example, Neufchâteau and Marche and beyond to the Meuse to seize some VP locations out in the west, or just to undermine and threaten the Allied positions. So my point here is that you've got a lot of options. It's a big learning experience. The rules are moderate complexity. There's a beautiful rulebook from Revolution Games. It is not very well illustrated. It is quite text heavy. There are no illustrated examples for anything throughout, but it is pretty clear, easy to grasp. The one thing that makes this a little bit difficult to play for new players is the many exceptions for each turn. There's this great sheet on Board Game Geek. There's also a sheet of combat modifiers on Board Game Geek. Check that out. This basically lists all the exceptions that apply throughout the various turns, and they're things like you cannot cross the Uran Bridge on the first turn. There are things like the 106th Division US forces will surrender if as apply at the end of the second turn, but no others. There are things like, on the first round, of course, a pretty easy one to remember, the Germans can convert DR and DR asterisk results to BL1. Both sides take a lost result. All these little things that you kind of need to be mindful of every turn, and they're easy things to miss. That's probably the complicating factor. And my first couple of plays, I made some critical mistakes here and basically had to reset and get started all over again. I'm probably still making some mistakes here and there. Critical in this German offensive is the road network and the use of that road bonus. Basically, motorized units, including armor, that start on a road can use the half MP movement cost to move along that road and advance along that road, provided they at no point in their movement stack or move through another friendly unit nor enter an enemy zone of control. They enter that EZOC there, they locked in and stop movement. This means no overlapping, no stacking, no moving through friendly units, getting friendly units off those roads so other units behind them can move through. And it creates almost a little puzzle going on within the German lines to clear those roads, make sure your big powerful armored units can move through, and trying to get those roads clear, basically. It's easier for the 5th Panzer Army in the center, where they have this big broad corridor of 1, 2, 3 key roads moving east to west. It is much, much, much more difficult for the 6th Panzer Army in the north, where they really have one key road south of the Amblive River to drive towards Malmedy, Stavelot, Trapont. And if they can't clear that road, they're not moving. They're slowly grinding to 1 hex at a time if they're lucky. So that's very interesting. There are some rules. So, for example, the 150th Brigade can move enemy zone of control to enemy zone of control once during the first 3 turns, but I still haven't been able to exploit with them as I think they're intended. So yeah, as a German player, you're thinking about this road network puzzle, and you're thinking about where to exploit. You're looking to move your mechanized or armored units quite rapidly around. They have a movement allowance of 6, and if they're not using those roads, they can burn this up. If they move through 2 woods hexes, they're done. That's as far as they get. If they move through lightly wooded hexes, they can move 3 hexes and they're done. Clear hexes cost 1 movement point, so they can move there are not many clear hexes around, so maybe 6 hexes if they're very, very lucky moving through the clear. Generally, they're moving 2 to 3 hexes if they're not using these roads. If they are using the roads, they're moving 12 hexes. So if they can punch a hole through the American lines and use that road network, they can move 12 hexes, about a third of the map. And that has happened in the last 2 games I played. They punched a hole in the American lines. They got a good activation draw, enabling them to move. and they've driven through and moved 12 hexes along these roads. The combat. Okay, so this uses a very simple attacker-friendly CRT, and this is something to be mindful of when you're playing the game. It is generous to the attackers. The very worst outcome they can suffer is an AL1 result. Even at 1 to 3 odds, you've only got a 50% chance of suffering a 1 to 3 loss, a 1 in 6 chance of forcing a defender retreat. So appreciating the implications here for what you're looking at, it basically means the Germans want to attack everywhere as much as possible even at low odds. It doesn't matter if you've got 1 to 1 odds, 1 to 2 odds, drive those attacks. The other reason for this is Allied artillery can be used once per activation chit. So if the 5th Panzer Army activates, the Allies can use every artillery piece they have. If the next chit drawn is a combat chit, the Allies can once again use their artillery, whereas the Germans can only use their artillery once per game turn, very limited. So if the Germans are doing multiple attacks in a turn, let's say they do 6 attacks, the Allies can only use core artillery once across those attacks. And so they want to force the Americans to use their artillery and spread their attacks out to try to force those DR results and create those gaps. Now, of course, it's a bulge game, and there are bridges, and 4 bridges begin blown in the southern sector of the map around the 7th Army. I haven't found these to be of much consequence. Down in the south, the 7th Army is mainly infantry, and they can just walk across bridges, across these minor rivers at a small movement point addition, typically 1 extra movement point. In the centre, with the 5th Panzer Army, they are moving through open terrain, typically around Bastogne, Wiltz, Clairvaux. There aren't a lot of bridges in this area. In the north, with the 6th Panzer Army, this is where you might expect to see some bridges blown. I haven't yet seen them break through, so the bridges near sort of Elsenborn, Stavelot, Trapont haven't come into play just yet. Just yet, I say. I say this just yet because, as I said, this is very replayable, and every time you play it, both sides, the Americans are learning. I'm learning as the Americans. I'm learning as the Germans, and that's. I think there's that feeling here that you need to play this game a couple of times to kind of appreciate all these little nuances, to value really where the reinforcements are coming on and where they should go. As I said, a lot of the American reinforcements coming on early in the north really need to push down south towards to confront the 5th Panzer Army. I've been doing that, but still clearly not in sufficient strength to stop their breakthrough and advance. So you're learning about these reinforcements and where they come on and what they can do, learning about artillery and how to use that, learning about the CRT and what it can do, learning about your various chits and how various chits come in on various turns. You don't have the same activation chits in the counter each turn. Instead, you consult the action chit availability chart. If it's the second turn, you simply look here and you place these chits into the cup. Early on, the Germans have the advantage here. They have a lot more chits, a lot more movement, combat, options, the initiative. At the start of a turn, of course, the initiative player chooses what chit they want to start with. And again, that gives the Germans a huge advantage because they'll have more chits. They'll often, in many circumstances, have, let's say, the last chit on a turn. And then they get to choose what the first chit is on the next turn. So let's say the 5th Panzer Army is the last to activate, and they've just destroyed this American unit near Bastogne. Initiative on the next turn, they can choose the 5th Panzer Army again to drive through that gap. It gives them the initiative for those turns and facilitates their advance. It makes it very difficult for the Allied players to respond to that. I mentioned the road network, and if you're not using that road network, the terrain is very tough. Indeed, there are some prohibited terrain features for armoured motorised units. These forests, basically, there's a lot of forest around Bastogne and Saint-Hubert in the west, which prevents movement of these motorised units if they're not following that road, if they're not using that road bonus via a path that is free of friendly and enemy units. What else? Look, the Germans can repair bridges. As I said, bridges have not featured prominently, apart from the need to control these bridges to cross these rivers. That's vital because motorised units can only cross these minor rivers at bridges. They're prohibited from crossing bridges elsewhere, so they need to control these bridges. And there are some critical bridges that they want to control. And yeah, otherwise they can't get across. Look, movement, combat, moderate complexity rules, quite a lot of exceptions that are difficult to keep in mind. I've mentioned that. There are assets that are brought into the game. These are things like artillery or engineers. The Americans have a delay marker that they can place. There are these Operation Grief and roadblock markers. I have found these to be almost completely redundant. They're such a diverse, the Allies in particular, as they're bringing their reinforcements on, they have so many road networks to use that they can easily just go around the single Operation Grief marker. I would really like to see the Germans have at least two of these. One just isn't enough to have any impact whatsoever. Every turn, every game I've played, the Germans place this, and they're only placed on turns 2 to 4, but they place this, and they've created a roadblock, and then the Americans go, okay, we're just going to go around that roadblock via this other road network. There aren't too many places where you can place this to have much effect. Conversely, I will point out that the American traffic marker has been slightly more effective. Yes, there's only one of these, but the Germans are typically driving in one focused location. So if the Americans place this pretty much on that location, or as they've been doing, placing this in the 6th Panzer Army area, where they've only got that one road network east-west towards Malmedy, if they can place that on that road network, it slows down all the Germans moving through that area. So that's more effective than the Operation Grief marker. The American delay marker, I mentioned that delay marker, that has been far more effective. I don't know where that's gone, but it has been, quite effective. They can only go to a village or town hex in supply, but it can be placed sort of in emergencies to basically stop the Germans. Here it is. It's in Malmedy, just in case the Germans did break through in the north. So look, folks, this is a great two-player game, great solitaire experience, a great solitaire study. There's this like a little puzzle that you're solving as both the Germans and the Americans, and I love that kind of aspect of games. I love looking at road networks and looking at where units can move to and around and studying potential paths. It conveys the feeling of the bulge, but again, it is heavily influenced by the chip pull mechanism and the order of activations. This has a huge impact on how your game will play out. On the first turn, if the Americans draw their 2 reinforcements, they're going to shut down this German advance, very quickly. Conversely, if the Germans on the first turn draw their 5th, 6th Panzer activations early, they can punch a hole through early before the Americans can bring their reinforcements on and do a great deal. So be aware of, I guess, the swinginess of the game based on that. I imagine it could be very frustrating at times if you're not getting activations when you need them. There are rules, of course, to limit consecutive activations. Basically, each side can only have 2 activations in a row. So the Americans can have 2 activations. If they draw a third, they put it back in the cup and they draw until they draw a German. And likewise, the Germans can only have 2 activations in a row. So there are rules to limit the advantage you can get there. But in the last turn of this last game that I played, for example, the Americans drew a lot of early activations. There was, I think, a German initiative and then 2 Americans, and then a German and then 2 Americans. And then the Americans were basically, in fact, the track is here. It was German combat, American reinforcement. German 1 army, American reinforcement. So the Americans got lucky to get all their reinforcements out early. Then there was a German move, and then 2 American chips, and then the Americans are done for the turn. And then we have 5 German activations in a row. And then they can activate in a row because there are no other American activations to come out of the cup. And it was those activations in a row that enabled them to just punch through, drive through, and hold onto those VP locations for a sudden death victory. So just be aware of that. I find it a great storytelling element for solitaire play, potentially frustrating for 2 opposing players potentially. Okay, it works both ways. Because it is a relatively fast-playing game, and a full game of this, look, each turn takes from 30 to 45 minutes. So if you're playing for the full 12 turns, you're looking at probably a 6 to 8 hour gaming experience. But as I said, my last two games have ended in sudden death victories for the Germans in 2 to 2.5 hours. So it does have the potential to play out quite quickly if you end the game early. Otherwise, you're looking at a long night or a full day game, again, with value from repeated play. So look, folks, again, I hope that has been informative. That is The Deadly Woods, The Battle of the Bulge, a Ted Raicer design published by Revolution Games in 2021. Another great addition to the Dark series, and another great addition to our Bulge games because of that broad scale, the German offensive, the Allied counterattack, chip draw mechanism, one mapper. It creates a really good gaming experience. Check it out if it is of interest, and thanks for watching.